The locket had never been opened, not once in 3 years, and the man who gave it to her was dead before she ever had the chance to ask him why he looked so guilty when he clasped it around her neck. Helen Carver stood at the edge of the Cimarron River in the autumn of 1878, her boots sinking slightly into the red mud of the bank, her dark hair caught by a wind that smelled of distant rain and dry sage. She was 26 years old, lean from grief and labor, with eyes the color of river water after a storm, not quite green, not quite gray, shifting depending on the light and her mood. In her right hand she held a fishing line she had no real intention of using. In her left hand, wrapped around her fist like a prayer she could not bring herself to say aloud, was the silver locket on its thin chain. She did not open it because she did not know what she would do when she did. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat about a mile east of where she stood, its main street already beginning to fill with the morning noise of a cattle town that never truly slept, the clang of the blacksmith, the creak of wagon wheels over sun-cracked earth, the distant low of cattle penned at the south end of town, waiting for the Kisham Trail drives that still moved through the territory, even as the railroad ate more of their purpose every season. It was a rough place, Caldwell. A border town with 1 foot in Kansas and 1 foot in Indian Territory, where the law was thin as paper in places, and the men who passed through were rougher than the land they rode across. Helen had come to Caldwell 2 years ago with her husband James Carver, who had been a man of optimism if not always good sense, and who had died of a fever 8 months after their arrival, not shot, not stabbed, not trampled by cattle as she had secretly feared in the early days, but quietly, sweating through the sheets of the small bed in the room above the dry goods store. He had barely gotten started before the sickness took him. The town had buried him with modest ceremony. Helen had taken over the store. She was good at it, it turned out. Better than James had been, though she thought that with a kind of tender sorrow rather than pride. She had a head for numbers, a directness with customers that some men found startling in a woman and most women found quietly satisfying, and a stubbornness that kept her from folding when the bank suggested twice that perhaps she would be better served selling and returning to wherever she had come from. She was from Missouri, originally. She had no intention of going back. The locket had come from James on their wedding day, nearly 4 years ago now. He had pressed it into her palm before the ceremony, his hand slightly cold despite the summer warmth, and told her it held something important, something she would want to have someday. He had said it strangely, with that guilty slant to his eyes she had noticed before but never quite understood. She had meant to ask him about it that very night, but the wedding celebration ran long and then they were exhausted, and then the days piled up and then James was sick, and then James was gone. And now she stood at the river holding a locket she had never opened, because opening it felt like the last conversation she and James would ever have, and she was not sure she was ready for it. She did not know that 10 minutes ago, a man named Paul Dawson had ridden into Caldwell on a dun-colored horse that was tired but not broken, carrying a letter of employment from the Caldwell Town Council in his breast pocket, and a reputation as a fair lawman that preceded him by about 3 counties. Paul Dawson was 31 years old, a deputy marshal out of Wichita who had accepted the position of town marshal for Caldwell after the previous one had taken a bullet in the shoulder during a dispute between 2 cattle outfits and decided retirement suited him better than the badge. Paul was not a particularly dramatic man. He did not swagger or drawl or perform any of the theater that some lawmen mistook for authority. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by someone who took their work seriously. He had gray eyes that noticed things without announcing they were noticing, and hands that were both careful and capable, the kind of hands that had held a gun and also, more often, held the reins steady when everything around him was going sideways. He had been married once briefly, to a woman named Clara who had left him not for any dramatic reason, But because the life of a lawman's wife in a frontier town had not been what she imagined, and she had been honest enough to say so and leave before it curdled into bitterness, he did not hate her for it. He sometimes thought he understood it better now than he had at the time. He tied his horse at the post outside the marshal's office, which was a low adobe and timber building with a jail cell in the back that smelled of old iron and tobacco, and spent the first part of the morning getting acquainted with his deputy, a young man named Amos Pratt who was 22 and eager, and had very good instincts for knowing when not to speak, which Paul considered a fine quality. "Quiet lately?" Paul asked, settling into the chair behind the desk and looking around the office with the practical eye of a man assessing what he had to work with. Amos considered the question. "Relatively." Had a pair of drovers from the Circle K outfit fight over a card game at the Silver Crown last Thursday. One of them lost 2 teeth. No guns drawn, though. And there's been some trouble with a man named Garrett Cole, runs a small outfit south of town, close to the territory line. He's been pushing some of the smaller homesteaders about water rights, and it started to get ugly. Ugly how? Someone pulled the posts on the Marsh family's fence line last week. Everybody knows it was Cole's men, but nobody saw it done. Paul nodded slowly. "All right. I'll ride out and have a conversation with Mr. Cole before the week's out. Anything else?" Amos hesitated in the way of a man who is not sure if what he's about to say is relevant. "There's a widow woman runs the dry goods store on the main street, Helen Carver. She's had some trouble with Cole's men coming in and helping themselves to things without paying, and when she's complained to the council they've been slow about it. She speaks her mind, Marshal. I'm just telling you so you're not caught off guard." Paul looked at him steadily. "I appreciate a person who speaks their mind." He did not think about Helen Carver again for the rest of that morning, which was occupied with paperwork and the orientation of himself to the geography of the town and its people. He met the mayor, a man named Gerald Foss who shook hands like he was afraid of them. He met the owner of the Silver Crown Saloon, a stout and cheerful man named Beaumont who pressed a bottle of decent whiskey into his hands as a welcome gift and gave him a thorough account of who in Caldwell was likely to be trouble and who was not. He ate lunch at a small establishment run by a Mexican woman named Senora Luz, whose chili stew was the best thing he had tasted in months, and who looked him over with frank appraisal before deciding he would do. He met Helen Carver that afternoon, and it did not go especially smoothly. He had come into the dry goods store to purchase a few items. He needed to set up his living quarters in the small room attached to the marshal's office, and also because Amos had suggested it was the best stocked store in town. The bell above the door announced him, and he stepped inside into the cool, dim smell of coffee and tobacco and dried goods, and something faintly floral that he would later realize was the lavender sachet Helen kept behind the counter to mask the smell of the oilcloth. She was arguing with a man. More precisely, she was standing behind the counter with her arms crossed, and her expression set in a way that suggested the argument was already over in her mind, and she was simply waiting for the man in front of her to arrive at the same conclusion. The man was large, broad, wearing the kind of worn leather vest that trail hands favored, and he was leaning on the counter with his forearms in a way that was designed to be physically intimidating and was not working as intended. "I'm telling you, Mrs. Carver, Mr. Cole said he'd settle the account at the end of the month, same as always," the man was saying, his voice carrying that particular blend of threat and casual entitlement that Paul recognized immediately. "Mr. Cole's account was due 3 weeks ago and has not been settled," Helen said, in a voice that was perfectly level and completely immovable. "I will be happy to extend credit again when the current account is cleared. That is my final word on the matter." "Mr. Cole isn't going to be happy about this. Mr. Cole's happiness is not my responsibility. Good afternoon." The large man straightened and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was working itself toward something uglier, and Paul moved. He did not hurry or make a scene of it. He simply stepped forward in a way that put himself between the large man's line of sight and Helen Carver, and he said, in a conversational tone, "Afternoon. Just the man I was hoping to run into. One of Cole's outfit, right? I'm the new marshal, Paul Dawson. I'd appreciate it if you'd tell Mr. Cole I'll be riding out to see him Thursday morning. Purely a courtesy call. And I'd appreciate it even more if you'd head on out of this store now and let this lady go about her business." There was a long beat. The large man looked at Paul with the calculating expression of someone assessing odds. What he found in Paul's gray eyes apparently settled the question, because he pushed off from the counter, gave Helen a look that tried and failed to be menacing, and walked out. The bell above the door jangled cheerfully behind him. Paul turned around. Helen Carver was looking at him with her arms still crossed and an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite irritation, but contained elements of both. "I had that handled," she said. "I don't doubt it," Paul said without any condescension, and he meant it. She studied him for a moment. "You're the new marshal, Paul Dawson. Just arrived this morning." She uncrossed her arms, not in capitulation but in the manner of a person deciding how much energy a thing is worth. "Helen Carver, I run this store." She paused. "Thank you for the intervention, even if it wasn't strictly necessary." "I'll take the thank you," he said, and something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I was told you were the best stocked store in town. I need coffee, a decent lamp oil, and something that passes for soap." Helen Carver looked at him for another moment with those stormwater eyes, and then she uncrossed her arms completely and moved to find what he needed. And Paul Dawson stood in the cool, dim light of her store and thought, in a quiet, unremarkable way, that he was very glad he had come into the store when he did. The thing about Caldwell in the autumn of 1878 was that it was a town in the middle of changing what it was, and not everyone was happy about the direction of that change. The cattle drives were still coming through, but fewer of them than even 5 years ago, and the men who had built their livelihood on the chaos of trail town commerce were feeling the pressure of a future that looked different from what they had planned. Garrett Cole was one of these men. He ran a modest cattle operation south of town, close enough to the Kishom Trail to benefit from it. But he had also, over the past 2 years, been systematically expanding his land through methods that ranged from questionable to outright dishonest. Paul rode out to see Cole on Thursday as promised, and found a man in his mid-40s with a handsome face gone slightly to hardness, and the eyes of someone who had gotten used to getting what he wanted through persistence and the application of pressure. Cole greeted him with the surface courtesy of a man who understood that lawmen were useful to have on your side and inconvenient to have against you. "Marshal Dawson," Cole said, standing on the porch of his ranch house with a cup of coffee and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the territory. What can I do for you?" "Pay your account at the dry goods store," Paul said pleasantly. "And keep your men from leaning on the people they owe money to. Beyond that, Mr. Cole, I'm just here to introduce myself and make sure we understand each other." Cole's smile did not change. "Helen Carver been crying to the law about a late payment. Mrs. Carver didn't come to me about anything. I was in her store. I observed the situation. My advice is to settle the account this week and keep your business dealings civil." Paul paused. "And the matter of the Marsh family's fence line is something I'm also looking into, just so you're aware." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to be interesting to have around, Marshal." "I hope so," Paul said, and rode back to Caldwell. He settled into the rhythm of the town over the following weeks, and it was in these weeks that he began to see Helen Carver with some regularity, because the town was not large, and a man who walks it attentively will encounter the same people often. He found in these encounters that she was not what he had initially assessed. He had taken her initially for purely practical, efficient, direct, self-sufficient. All of these things were true. But there was something underneath them that he began to glimpse in fragments, the way you glimpse the bottom of a river only when the water is briefly still. She was funny, for one thing. Not in a performed way, but with a dry, quick wit that appeared unexpectedly and disappeared just as fast, like she was not entirely comfortable with how much she enjoyed making someone laugh. She was also, he realized, lonely in a way she had probably stopped noticing, because it had been with her so long that it had become simply the condition of her life rather than a specific absence. She knew everyone in Caldwell and was respected by most of them and invited to the few social events the town produced, and she was still, somehow, fundamentally alone. He learned these things slowly, in the way you learn a landscape, by walking it repeatedly under different conditions. October arrived and brought with it the particular beauty of the Kansas plains in fall, when the light went gold and the grass turned amber and the sky became an enormous clear blue thing that made you feel, depending on your temperament, either very free or very small. Helen had always found it made her feel both at once, which she thought was probably the honest response. She was taking inventory one afternoon in the back room of the store, working through a new shipment of dry goods that had come in on the supply wagon from Wichita, when the bell above the front door announced a customer. She came out wiping her hands on her apron and found Paul Dawson standing at the counter, not browsing, just standing there with his hat in his hands and an expression of mild uncertainty that she had not seen on him before. "Marshal," she said. "You need something?" "Coffee," he said, "and I was wondering if you'd eaten lunch." She stopped and looked at him. He did not elaborate, which she found she respected. He was not going to paper over the question with excessive explanation. "No," she said. "I was going to close up for an hour around noon." "Senora Luz's," he said, "if you're inclined." She was quiet for a moment. She was aware that this was something, the asking of it. She was also aware that she was hungry and that Senora Luz's was very good, and that the fact that she was making more of this than it needed to be was perhaps itself significant. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. They ate at a small table near the window of Senora Luz's establishment, with the noon sun making warm squares on the wooden floor and the sounds of the main street coming through the half-open door. Senora Luz brought them stew and bread without being asked, looked at them both with an expression of benign knowing, and withdrew. They talked about the town at first, which was neutral ground, the supply situation, the question of whether the railroad spur would come through by spring or get pushed to the following year, the matter of the Marsh family, and the ongoing problem of Garrett coal. Helen had strong opinions about coal that she expressed with a precision Paul found both informative and enjoyable. She had been watching him operate for 2 years, and she had cataloged his methods with the eye of someone who had learned, through necessity, to understand exactly how a dishonest man thinks. "He does it in small steps," she said, tearing a piece of bread with her hands. "Each individual thing seems almost reasonable. The fence line, well, maybe the Marsh family was wrong about where the property line was. The late payments, it's been a hard season, anyone can have a difficult month. But when you put them all together in sequence, you see the pattern. He's wearing people down, wearing the town down." "That's how a lot of men like Cole work," Paul agreed. "The dramatic ones are easier to deal with. The patient ones are harder." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "You've dealt with a lot of men like Cole. Enough to have a healthy respect for how dangerous they are," he said. "They never make themselves the villain in their own story. That's what makes them effective." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What made you come to Caldwell? You could have stayed in Wichita." He considered the question honestly. The previous posting felt finished, and Caldwell felt like a town that needed not necessarily saving but steadying. There's a difference. A town being saved is dramatic. A town being steadied is just daily work. He paused. "I'm better at the daily work." "So am I," she said, and looked out the window, and something in the way she said it made him understand that she was speaking about more than the store. After that, the lunches became a quiet pattern. Not every day that would have been conspicuous in a town the size of Caldwell, and neither of them was interested in being conspicuous. But 2 or 3 times a week, they found themselves at the same table at Senora Luz's, or on days when the store was too busy for Helen to leave, with Paul bringing coffee and sitting across the counter from her while she worked. The conversations expanded from the town to themselves, gradually, the way a river expands after rain, not a sudden flood but a steady widening. He told her about growing up in Missouri, which surprised her because she had also grown up there, and they spent a delighted hour establishing that they were from towns about 40 miles apart and had almost certainly been at the same county fair in the summer of 1864, when they would have been 12 and 8 respectively, which somehow made them both laugh. She told him about coming to Kansas with James, and she told it honestly, not bitterly but not with false nostalgia either. James had been a good man with a big heart and not very much practical sense, and she had loved him the way you love someone who brings warmth into the world even if they also bring complications. His death had been the kind of thing that reshapes a person entirely. She had come out of those dark months after his passing as someone she did not quite recognize, but had gradually decided to accept, and even in some ways to prefer. He believed in things, she said, one afternoon in November when the wind was too cold for the walk to Senora Luz's, and they were both sitting by the small potbelly stove in the back room of the store with cups of coffee. Genuinely believed in them. He came out here because he was certain there was something wonderful about to happen on the frontier, some great opening of the world. He wasn't wrong, exactly. He just didn't account for how hard the opening part would be. Paul was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss him?" "Every day," she said simply, "but differently now than I did at first. At first it was like missing a limb. Now it's more like an understanding of what things cost, of what it means to have something and then not have it." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said, and she believed him. She had worn the locket every day since James died. It was a habit that had become so ingrained she no longer thought about it consciously. She clasped it around her neck each morning the way she put on her boots, without ceremony. She was wearing it the afternoon they had this conversation, and Paul noticed it because he was the kind of man who noticed things, but he did not ask about it that day. He waited, because he understood that some questions have to wait for the right moment, and this was not yet the right moment. The trouble with Garrett Cole came to a head in late November, and it happened faster than Paul had expected, which told him he had underestimated how desperate Cole was getting. The Marsh family, Robert Marsh, his wife Ada, and their 3 children had the bad luck to own a quarter section that sat directly over the best water source in the southern part of the county, a spring-fed creek that Cole needed if he was going to expand his operation the way he planned. Cole had been trying to buy them out for over a year, and the Marshes had consistently refused. And now, apparently, Cole had decided to move beyond the slowware method and into something more direct. What happened was this. Someone, in the dead of the second night of December, set fire to the Marsh family's barn. They got the livestock out but lost the structure completely, and Robert Marsh came into town the next morning with his jaw set, and his eyes bright with a fury he was barely containing, and went straight to Paul's office. Paul listened to the whole account, asked careful questions, and then rode out to Cole's ranch with Amos Pratt beside him, and the kind of quiet in his face that Amos had already learned meant the situation was serious. Cole received them with the careful composure of a man who has prepared himself for this visit. He denied everything with smooth, measured statements that were almost impossible to disprove. His men had an alibi. They had all been at the Silver Crown that evening, as a number of witnesses would confirm. He expressed appropriate sympathy for the Marsh's loss. He offered, with a generosity that made Paul's jaw tighten, to purchase the Marsh property for a fair price, now that the family had suffered this terrible misfortune. Paul looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Cole," he said, "you are a careful man. I respect that, the way you'd respect a complicated lock. But I want you to know that I am also a patient man, and I will be paying close attention to everything that happens in this county for however long it takes." He paused. "The Marshes have decided to stay, by the way." I helped Robert Marsh file the necessary paperwork this morning to ensure his property rights are fully recorded and documented with the county. It'll be harder to challenge that now." He let that sit for a moment, and then he tipped his hat and rode back to town. Cole's alibi checked out, and Paul could not prove the arson at this stage. But the county documentation was real, and it changed the landscape of Cole's options. Paul also had quiet conversations with 3 of Cole's former hands who had left his employ in the past year, and what they told him went into a carefully kept ledger that Paul intended to present to the county judge as soon as he had enough to make a case that would hold. Helen heard about all of this in the incremental way that a person who is paying attention hears things in a small town. She also heard it directly from Paul, because by December he had arrived at the comfortable habit of stopping by the store in the evenings when she was closing up, and they would talk for an hour while she balanced the accounts and he drank her coffee, which was better than anything he made for himself. It was domestic in a way that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but which both of them felt as a warmth distinct from the small stove they sat beside. One evening in the first week of December, with snow threatening outside and the lamp making the back room of the store feel very warm and enclosed, he looked across the counter at her and saw the locket at her throat, really looked at it, the way he had been not quite looking at it for weeks, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" She glanced up from the ledger. "You're going to regardless," she said without edge. He smiled at that, the real one that reached his eyes, the one she had discovered she looked for. "That locket," he said. "You wear it every day, but I've never seen you open it. Not once." Helen set down her pencil. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat with 2 fingers, the automatic gesture of someone who has done it 1,000 times. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring look she had, not defensive, just honest assessment. "James gave it to me the day we were married," she said. "He said there was something important inside and I'd want to have it someday. He died before I ever asked him what he meant." She paused. "So I never opened it." Paul watched her face. "Why not?" And Helen Carver was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the snow outside began to fall in earnest, ticking against the single window of the back room. She looked down at the locket between her fingers and then back up at him. "I was saving it," she said. The words were simple and she said them simply, but they carried the weight of 3 years inside them, 3 years of grief and dailiness and survival, and the particular discipline of a woman who had learned to portion out the things that mattered so that they did not all run out at once. Paul did not speak for a moment. He understood the thing she had said without needing it explained, and his understanding of it was written clearly enough on his face that she saw it, and something that had been held very carefully inside her shifted slightly, like a door opening just enough to let light through. "What do you think is in it?" he asked finally, gently. "I don't know," she said. "That's the other part of it. I'm not sure I'm ready to find out." He nodded slow. "When you are," he said, "I'd like to be there, if that's all right with you." She looked at him with those stormwater eyes, and something moved through them that was not quite tears and not quite relief, but was something in the territory of both. "All right," she said. The snow fell on Caldwell all through that night and into the next morning, and it made the town quiet and briefly beautiful, softening the hard edges of the buildings and laying a clean white sheet over the mud of the main street. Helen opened the store later than usual and found that Paul had already cleared the snow from her doorstep before she arrived, which she discovered because of the neat pile of it at the side of the step and the distinctive single set of large boot prints leading away. She stood there for a moment looking at this evidence with an expression she was glad no one was around to see. The winter deepened, and the town pulled inward the way prairie towns do in the cold months, and the social life of Caldwell concentrated itself into the handful of establishments that offered warmth. The Silver Crown was the primary gathering place, and Helen occasionally attended the small social events held there, the occasional fiddle night, the December gathering the mayor's wife organized every year that was nominally a church social and practically an excuse for the women of Caldwell to spend an evening together without their husband's constant editorial presence. It was at this gathering that Helen had a conversation that stuck with her. Ada Marsh was there, quieter than usual. The business with the barn had shaken her badly, though she was as determined as her husband to stay on their land. She sat beside Helen at one point in the evening and said, in the direct way of women who have been through enough that they have stopped finding circumspection useful, "That new marshal is a good man." "He seems to be," Helen agreed. Ada looked at her with a small, knowing expression. "He cleared the snow off your step, I heard." Helen looked at her. "Small town," Ada said, not unkindly. "Very small," Helen agreed. Ada was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup between her hands. "He looks at you the way Robert looked at me before he worked up the nerve to say anything." She glanced up. "Just so you know." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Ada," she said finally, "I'm a widow." "So was half the women on the frontier at one point or another," Ada said, with the pragmatic compassion of someone who understood that this was simply true. "That's not the question, is it?" Helen looked into her own coffee cup. "No," she admitted quietly. "I suppose it isn't." The question was something she turned over for the rest of December, through the cold, bright days and the longer evenings, in the particular interior way of a woman who has learned to do her most important thinking quietly, without making a production of it. She was aware of Paul Dawson in a way that she could no longer pretend was simply the awareness of a person she regularly saw and spoke with. It was more specific than that, more particular. She noticed the way he listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening with his whole attention. She noticed that he never tried to manage her or explain her life back to her or suggest what she should feel about things. She noticed that she laughed more now than she had in years, and that a significant portion of that laughter had him somewhere in the vicinity of it. She also noticed that she had stopped reaching for the locket with the compulsive, anxious touch that had characterized her relationship with it for 3 years. She still wore it, but she no longer clutched it as an anchor. It had become simply something she carried, and the difference was subtle but real. Christmas came to Caldwell in the form of a cold, clear day with a hard blue sky, and the smell of pine boughs from the small trees some of the settlers had dragged in from the creek bottoms. Helen was invited to Christmas dinner at the Foss household. The mayor's wife, Martha Foss, was one of those women of genuine warmth who made sure no one in town spent the holiday alone. And she arrived to find, among the assembled guests, Paul Dawson, who was sitting somewhat awkwardly in a parlor chair talking to the mayor about county politics with the expression of a man who is being polite about something that does not particularly interest him. He looked up when she came in, and the change in his expression was immediate and unguarded, a lightening, a relief, a genuine gladness. And he stood as she entered in the old courtesy of a man who had been raised with certain habits, and their eyes met across the room with the particular communicative clarity of two people who have by this point established a language between them. They were seated next to each other at dinner, not by accident. Martha Foss was a woman of considerable social engineering, and the meal was long and good, with a roasted turkey and sweet potatoes and a dried apple pie that was perhaps the best thing Helen had eaten since her mother's kitchen in Missouri. The conversation at the table was general and cheerful, and underneath it, in the small space between the two of them, there was a quieter conversation happening, the glance, the passing of the bread, the small acknowledging smile when something was said that both of them found funny. Walking back to her store afterward through the cold, clear evening, with the stars extremely present in the prairie sky, and the sound of someone's fiddle coming from the direction of the Silver Crown, Helen thought with great clarity that she was, against all reasonable expectation, happy. Not in the distant, tentative way of someone who has agreed to be happy as a matter of principle, but in the immediate, particular way of a person who is in the right place at the right time with something real growing in their chest. She also thought very clearly that it was time to open the locket. She did not open it that night. She thought about it for another week, turning the decision over the way she had turned the locket itself, examining it from every angle. Part of her hesitation was the old grief, the sense that opening it was closing something she was not ready to close. But she was beginning to understand that this was not true. Opening it was not closing James. James was already closed, had been closed for 3 years, and her grief for him was real and always would be, and it did not mean she had to remain in the anteroom of her own life forever. The other part of her hesitation was simpler and more surprising. She was nervous. Whatever James had put in the locket, he had put there with intention and with that particular guilty tender expression, and she did not know what it would be or what it would mean. She told Paul, on a January evening that was so cold the inside of the store windows were frosted at the edges, that she was ready. He came after closing time, when the store was empty and quiet and the lamp was turned down low, and he sat across the small table from her in the back room the way he always sat, with his coffee in his hands and his full attention on her. Helen took the locket from around her neck and laid it on the table between them. It was a simple thing, as lockets went oval, silver, with a small engraved border that had worn slightly smooth in the years of daily wearing. Not expensive. James had not been an expensive man. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at Paul, who was watching her with an expression of quiet, steady encouragement, not hurrying her, not speaking, just being entirely present with her. She picked up the locket and pressed the small catch at the side, and it opened. Inside was not a photograph, as she had half expected. It was a small folded piece of paper, very thin, tucked into the left side of the locket, and on the other side, in the right half, was a small pressed flower, a violet, dry as dust and faded to a pale purple-gray but recognizable. Helen carefully unfolded the paper. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. James had written in his somewhat large and imprecise handwriting, "Helen, I borrowed $23 from your household savings to put toward this venture, and I never told you. I'm sorry. I'll pay it back when the store is doing well. I promise. I love you more than I have ever said right. The violet is from the day I first saw you when you were picking flowers by your mother's fence, and I thought you were the most alive person I'd ever seen. Keep being that. James." She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the table, and she pressed both her hands flat against the wood, and she breathed. "Helen," Paul said very gently. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright, but she was not crying, or not quite. "He took $23 from the household savings to put toward opening the store," she said, and there was a particular quality to her voice, relief and grief and tender amusement, all wound together into something that was too complicated for a single word. He felt so guilty about it he put a confession in a locket. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "James." Paul was watching her face with the kind of careful attention that held both distance and nearness at once, near enough to catch her if she needed it, far enough to let her have the moment that was hers. "He loved you," Paul said. It was not a consolation or a filler. He said it as a simple, evident fact. "He did," she said, in his complicated, impractical, big-hearted way. She looked down at the locket and the small piece of paper and the pressed violet. "He was right about that $23, by the way. The store is doing well." She said it with a sound in her voice that was definitely a laugh, the genuine one, and Paul smiled watching it happen, that full, real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger and less guarded. Helen sat with the open locket for a while longer, and Paul sat with her, not making it about anything other than what it was. When she finally closed the locket again and laid it on the table, she felt lighter in a way she had not been prepared for. 3 years of wondering, and it was $23 and a pressed violet, and a love letter from a man who had not known how to say things right when he was alive, but who had, apparently, found a way to say them for after. She looked at Paul across the table and said, "Thank you for being here." "There's nowhere I would rather be," he said, and the simplicity of it went straight through her like light through water. January moved into February with the cold deepening, and then breaking in the pattern of the Kansas plains. where a warm wind could come from nowhere in the middle of winter and make you believe briefly that spring had arrived early, before the cold returned to remind you otherwise. Helen and Paul existed in this season in a state of careful nearness. The lunches, the evenings, the easy conversations that had become the architecture of their days, and the thing between them was evident to everyone in Caldwell who was paying attention, which was essentially everyone, but it had not yet been spoken plainly, and they were both, for slightly different reasons, taking their time with it. Paul's reason was straightforward. He did not want to rush her. He had watched her open the locket, and he had seen what was inside it. Not just the letter and the flower, but the interior of a woman who had learned to hold things gently because they had a habit of leaving, and he was not going to be another thing that arrived too quickly and damaged what it touched. Helen's reason was more complicated, as her reasons tended to be. She knew what she felt. She was honest enough with herself to have stopped pretending it was simply friendship some time ago. But knowing what she felt and knowing what to do with what she felt were two different operations, and she was doing the second one carefully. There was also, underneath everything, a practical matter. Her life was here. The store was here. She had built something in Caldwell with her own hands and her own stubbornness, and it was real and it was hers, and any rearrangement of her life had to take that seriously. It was a conversation with Senora Luz that finally broke something loose. Helen had stopped in at the restaurant one afternoon in early February, not for lunch, but to collect the monthly delivery order that Senora Luz placed through the store, and she found the older woman in an unusual mood, thoughtful and somewhat melancholy, standing at the window of her restaurant looking out at the main street. "Senora," Helen said, concerned. "Is everything all right?" Senora Luz looked at her for a moment. "My husband has been gone 14 years, she said. In 14 years, one man has come through this town who looked at me the way my husband did, like I was the most interesting thing in any room I walked into. And I waited too long to say anything, and he moved on." She looked back at the window. "I think about it sometimes. I'm not telling you this for any particular reason." Helen said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What would you have said?" Senora Luz smiled, small and wry and warm. "Something very simple," she said. "Something true." Helen walked back to the store with the order in her hands and Senora Luz's words sitting in the middle of her chest like a stone. Not heavy but specific, the kind of thing that once you feel it, you cannot unfeel it. She was closing the store that evening when Paul came, as he usually did, and she let him in and they went to the back room and he poured the coffee, which he had started doing without being asked, and he set her cup in front of her and sat across the table, and she looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. "Paul," she said. "Helen," he said. She folded her hands on the table. "I want to say something and I need you to let me finish it before you say anything." He put his coffee cup down and gave her his full attention. She took a breath. "When James died, I put myself away. Not deliberately, I didn't decide to do it, I just did it, the way you close a window when the weather turns cold. And I built a life here that I'm proud of and that is mine, and I thought that was enough. I thought I was enough on my own, which is true, I am. But there's a difference between being enough on your own and choosing to be alone, and I think I've been choosing the second one while telling myself it was the first." She paused. He was watching her steadily, not interrupting. "What I'm trying to say in the most roundabout way possible is that this," she gestured between them, a small, precise gesture, "means something to me. It has for a while. And I am done waiting to say it." Paul was quiet for the space of 2 breaths, and she could see something moving through his face, not surprise exactly, because she did not think she had actually surprised him, but the particular thing that happens in a person when something they have hoped for becomes real. "Helen," he said, "I fell in love with you sometime around the second or third conversation we had, and I have been trying to be patient and careful about it because you deserved patience and carefulness, and it has been the hardest project I have ever undertaken." She looked at him. "That's very honest." "I'm a very honest man," he said, and she laughed the real, unguarded laugh that he had spent 4 months accumulating like a man collecting something precious. And the laugh was still in the air between them when he reached across the small table and took her hand. And she turned her hand over and held his. And the lamp burned warm and the wind moved outside, and the town of Caldwell went about its business entirely unaware that in the back room of the dry goods store on its main street, two people who had both been alone for a long time had just, very quietly, stopped being so. He kissed her that evening. She did not let him get away without it, standing in the doorway of the store before he walked back to the marshal's office, with the cold February air coming in around them and the stars thick above the main street. It was brief and careful and genuine, and she stood in the doorway after he left and pressed 2 fingers to her lips and thought that she had been right to wait and right, finally, to stop. The spring came to the plains in the way it always came, in a rush of green and warmth that seemed almost aggressive after the long gray of winter. And with it came a new development in the matter of Garrett Cole. Paul had been building his case quietly through the winter, accumulating testimony and documentation, with the patient thoroughness of someone who understands that the strongest cases are built slowly. By March, he had 3 former Cole employees willing to testify about the orders they had received regarding the marsh property, and a land surveyor's report that established clearly that the fence line Cole had been challenging had in fact been correctly placed. He also had a letter from the county judge in Wichita indicating that Cole's various filings regarding water rights and property access had been reviewed and found to be without merit. Cole did not take this news with grace. He took it with a controlled fury that showed itself in the sudden disappearance of 2 of his most aggressive hands from his employ. Paul was fairly certain this was Cole covering his tracks rather than any genuine change in direction. And in a pointed conversation with Mayor Foss about whether the town really needed a marshal who was so dedicated to causing trouble for honest cattle operators. Mayor Foss, who was a cautious man in most situations, had apparently found, over the winter, that he admired Paul's approach to his work enough to decline this particular suggestion. He told Cole that the marshal was doing his job well, and the town was satisfied with the arrangement. Cole left the meeting unsatisfied, and Paul was told about it by Martha Foss, who had an uncanny ability to know the details of conversations that took place behind closed doors. In April, with the wildflowers coming up along the creek banks and the air smelling of new grass and possibility, the county judge came to Caldwell to hear the accumulated evidence Paul had gathered, and Cole's various claims were dismissed. The Marsh family's property rights were fully affirmed. The water rights dispute was resolved in their favor. Garrett Cole was not arrested. The arson could not be proven to the legal standard required, but his operations were effectively hemmed in, and his influence in the county was substantially diminished. He sold his ranch to an incoming cattle operator from Texas by the summer's end and left the territory. Robert Marsh came to the marshal's office and shook Paul's hand with a grip that communicated something beyond what words were adequate to express. And then he went to Helen's store and spent more money than he probably should have on things his family needed. And Helen gave him a 10% discount without telling him, adjusting the numbers with the small smile of someone who is using the tools they have to do the good they can. April also brought a development that was more personal in nature. Helen's younger sister Clara, not to be confused with Paul's former wife, a fact that made them both laugh somewhat helplessly when it first came up, arrived on the supply wagon from Wichita with a trunk and a letter explaining that the man she had been intending to marry had turned out to be already married, and that she was in need of somewhere to recover her composure and her sense of humor, both of which had taken a significant blow. Clara was 22 and looked remarkably like Helen, except that she laughed faster and cried more readily, and had an opinion about everything she had ever encountered, which she was willing to share at considerable length. She was also genuinely good company, and she took one look at Paul Dawson and turned to her sister with an expression of frank approval and said, "Oh, he'll absolutely do," in a voice that was not quite quiet enough. Paul, who had heard this, went very briefly red in a way that Helen found completely charming. Clara stayed in the room above the store that had been James's, and she turned out to be useful in a way Helen had not expected. She had a genuine talent for organization, and she took over the inventory management within 2 weeks with an efficiency that Helen had to admit exceeded her own. Having her sister there changed the texture of Helen's days in ways both comfortable and occasionally aggravating, and she was surprised by how much she had missed the aggravating parts. Clara, for her part, took an intelligent interest in the situation between Helen and Paul and restrained herself, with visible effort, from commenting on it constantly. She made her approval known clearly and then stepped back and let it be what it was going to be, which was, in Helen's estimation, exactly the right thing to do. The spring evening when Paul first told Helen he loved her in the explicit, unambiguous way, not the roundabout statement in the back room in February, but the direct, standing in the open words, was a warm April night with the creek frogs loud and the moon enormous above the prairie, and they were sitting on the bench outside the store after the street had gone quiet. He had not been planning it specifically. They had been talking about entirely ordinary things: the new survey of the county road, a letter he had received from his brother in Missouri, Clara's energetic reorganization of the store's back room, and there had been a pause in the conversation, the comfortable kind, and he had looked at her in the moonlight, and the words had simply arrived, straightforward and unstoppable the way things are when they have been true for a long time. "I love you, Helen," he said. "I have for a while. I thought you should hear it plainly." She turned to look at him, and the moonlight was on her face, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, which was not about the moonlight. He had thought this in poor light and in the plainness of noon and in the gray winter mornings, but the moonlight did not hurt. "I love you too," she said, plainly and truly. "I thought you should hear that plainly as well." He took her hand the way he had taken it that February evening, and she leaned her head, just slightly, against his shoulder, and they sat there in the warm night while the frogs sang at the creek and the stars did their old, reliable business above the prairie. And it was, Helen thought with a clarity that surprised her, exactly what being alive was supposed to feel like. The summer of 1879 moved through Caldwell with the particular heat and beauty of the Kansas plains. Long days and dramatic thunderstorms that rolled in from the west and turned the sky green before unloading themselves in great rattling sheets of rain that filled the creek and turned the streets to mud, and then retreated, leaving everything washed and bright. Helen and Paul moved through this summer in the easy, deepening way of two people who have found their footing with each other and are building something real. There were evenings on the bench outside the store. There were Sunday afternoons when the store was closed, and they rode out onto the prairie together on borrowed horses, Paul on his dun, Helen on the steady gray mare she had been keeping at the town's stable for 2 years, and the plains opened around them into a vastness that made speech unnecessary. There were conversations that went on for hours, covering everything and nothing, the kind of talk that is less about the exchange of information and more about the pleasure of existing in the same space with someone whose company you find endlessly interesting. Clara watched all of this with an expression of restrained delight that occasionally escaped its restraint, and Senora Luz smiled every time they came into the restaurant together. And Amos Pratt, who was young and romantic in a way he would never have admitted to, found that he was inordinately pleased whenever the marshal came back to the office after an evening at the store in a mood that could only be described as fundamentally content. Paul proposed to Helen on the afternoon of the 4th of July, 1879, which Caldwell celebrated with a modest ceremony on the main street, involving a great deal of patriotic speeches from Mayor Foss and a picnic that the women of the town organized in the field at the east end of the main street. and which was in every sense of the word a better celebration for what Paul did in the middle of it. He had given some thought to dramatic gestures, and had concluded that Helen would find them embarrassing, and that he would feel foolish performing them. And so instead he had simply, in the middle of the afternoon when they had wandered slightly away from the main crowd toward the shade of the cottonwood trees at the edge of the field, produced the ring he had ordered from Wichita 6 weeks ago. A simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it. Turquoise because it was the blue-green of the creek water in summer, and he had thought of her eyes and held it out to her and said, "Helen, I'd like very much to spend the rest of my life with you, if you're willing to have me." She had looked at the ring for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read, and then she had looked at him with those storm-water eyes and said, "I have one condition." "Name it," he said. "The store stays mine," she said. "In my name, the business stays mine." "Obviously," he said with complete sincerity. She looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. "Then yes, I am very willing to have you." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the summer light. And then she looked at him, and she kissed him there under the cottonwood trees with the 4th of July celebration carrying on cheerfully behind them. And somewhere in the crowd, Clara let out a sound that was loud enough to make several people look in their direction, which caused Helen to step back from Paul and give her sister a look of eloquent exasperation that Clara received with a completely unrepentant grin. The wedding was in September, which everyone agreed was the best month in Kansas. The heat had broken. The sky was that specific deep blue that only appeared after summer, and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone gold at the edges. They were married in the small church at the north end of Caldwell by Reverend Alcott, who was a practical man with genuine warmth, and who kept the ceremony to the point without sacrificing its meaning. The whole town came, or most of it. Senora Luz brought a wedding cake that was a small miracle. Ada and Robert Marsh were there with all 3 of their children. Amos stood up beside Paul with an expression of solemn happiness, and Clara stood beside Helen in a dress of green cotton that she had made herself and which was, by anyone's standard, a complete success. Helen wore a dress of pale gray-blue silk that she had ordered from Wichita months ago, that exactly matched, as Paul told her afterward in a voice that was quiet and only for her, the color of her eyes in certain light. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers from the creek bank that she had gathered that morning herself, including several late-season violets, which she had pressed the night before into the pages of her account book, for reasons she did not feel the need to explain to anyone. She wore the locket. It was closed, as it always was. The letter and the pressed violet inside were not going anywhere, and she was not going to open it again today, because today was not about the past. But she wore it because James had given it to her, and because he had loved her, and because carrying that forward was not the same as being stuck in it. And she knew, walking down the aisle toward Paul Dawson, who was standing at the altar looking at her with the kind of steady, luminous attention that made her feel entirely known and entirely chosen, that she had understood this now in the way she had not before. The ceremony was brief and sincere. When Paul said his vows, he said them looking directly at her with those gray eyes, and the words were old words made new by the fact that he meant every single one of them with the entire considerable force of his attention. When she said hers, she said them with equal directness, and she felt the truth of them all the way through, not the nervous, uncertain hope of a first marriage, but the deliberate, clear-eyed commitment of a person who has understood what it costs and chosen it anyway with open eyes. When Reverend Alcott pronounced them married and Paul kissed her, the assembled town of Caldwell responded with an enthusiasm that was more suited to the Silver Crown on a Saturday night than a church on a September afternoon, and the Reverend smiled and nobody minded at all. The reception was at the field east of town, with long tables and Senora Luz's food, and 2 fiddle players from the Kishom Trail outfit currently camped south of town, who had been invited by Amos with considerable diplomatic skill, and who turned out to be genuinely excellent musicians. People danced on the flattened grass in the September evening, and the stars came out while the fiddles were still playing, and Clara danced with what appeared to be half the men of Caldwell in succession, and Ada Marsh's children fell asleep under one of the tables before sunset and nobody moved them because they looked peaceful. Helen and Paul danced together the way they did most things, without performance, simply and directly and with complete attention to each other. He was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said he had a mother who believed dancing was a practical life skill and had made sure all her children could manage it, and Helen thought that she very much would have liked his mother, who had died 10 years ago of pneumonia. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the night was full and sweet, they walked back along the main street together, and the town of Caldwell was quiet around them in the specific way of a place that has gone to sleep content. He had arranged for them to stay in the hotel at the end of the street for that night. His living quarters were too small, and the room above her store now belonged to Clara, and they walked past the store on the way, and Helen glanced at it with the particular satisfaction of someone looking at something they have built. "Thank you," she said, suddenly. He glanced at her. "For what?" "For the snow on the doorstep," she said. "In December." That was the first moment I let myself think that this might be something. He was quiet for a moment. "That was also when I thought it might be something," he said. "I told myself it was just being neighborly, and I did not convince myself for a single second." She laughed. He pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders, and they walked the rest of the way in the comfortable warmth of each other, and the prairie stars burned above them in the old, indifferent, beautiful way they always had. They spent the autumn settling into the life of being married, which was, in the specific case of Helen and Paul Dawson, a process of accommodating two thoroughly formed individuals into a single domestic arrangement, and it went more smoothly than either of them might have expected, largely because they had been doing a version of it for almost a year already in the back room of the store. Paul moved into the rooms above the store. It was the larger accommodation and made more practical sense, and Clara, who had shown no particular interest in returning to Missouri and a great deal of interest in staying in Caldwell, took the room next to the marshal's office that Paul had vacated, which Amos fixed up for her with an industry that Paul observed with carefully concealed amusement and Helen observed with openly declared delight. The store continued to do well. Paul's work continued, the daily steadying work of a town that was growing up from a rough trail town into something with aspirations of longer-term civilization, more families arriving, a school being organized by a determined schoolteacher named Miss Hargrove, who had come west from Ohio with a trunk full of books and an absolute conviction that education was the hinge everything else turned on, a second church being built at the south end of town by a Methodist congregation. Helen joined the school committee and was quietly but effectively influential on it, ensuring that Miss Hargrove got the building supplies she needed through the store at cost, and that the books were properly accounted for in the town budget, and that Mayor Foss did not postpone the project indefinitely, which was his tendency with anything that required present commitment for future benefit. The injustice of the territory was something she thought about, especially in the winter evenings when the conversation went long. The Kishom Trail that ran through their county cut through land that had once belonged to the Comanche and the Kiowa, and before them, others whose names were not written in any document that the county seat kept, and the treaties that were supposed to govern these things were being honored in the way that treaties had generally been honored on the frontier, which was to say selectively, and with considerable flexibility in the direction of the stronger party. Paul had encountered, in his work, the particular cruelty of a legal system that extended its protection to some, and not others based on categories that had nothing to do with the actual content of a person's character or their claim on the land they lived on. He talked about it with Helen, and what he found was that she had been thinking about it for longer than he had, in the way of someone who has been in one place long enough to see the patterns clearly. The same thing Cole did to the marshes, she said one evening with a quiet precision, is what was done on a much larger scale for much longer to people who had no county judge to appeal to. She looked at the fire. We can't fix it. I know that, but we can know it, and maybe how you know something changes how you act inside the small circle of what you actually can affect. He thought about this for a long time. It was, he concluded, one of the most useful things anyone had ever said to him. The following spring, 1880, brought several developments simultaneously, which was the way of life on the frontier where events tended to arrive in clusters rather than the orderly sequence one might prefer. The first was that the railroad spur came through, not directly to Caldwell, as had been promised and delayed for 3 years, but close enough to change the character of the cattle trade and the town's relationship to the wider world. The supply wagons from Wichita became less essential, and the store's ordering changed accordingly, and Helen spent a stimulating month renegotiating her supply arrangements with several new vendors who came through on the heels of the railroad, and proved, to the general satisfaction of everyone who observed it, that she was an extremely capable businesswoman. The second was that Amos Pratt and Clara Carver acknowledged, apparently to their own as well as everyone else's complete lack of surprise, that they had been in love with each other for approximately 7 months, and Amos came to Paul's office one morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is about to say something important and is trying very hard to be calm about it. "Marshal," he said, "I'd like to ask Miss Carver to marry me. I know she's Mrs. Dawson's sister and I wanted to speak to you first, out of respect." Paul looked at him for a long moment. He was aware that Amos Pratt was 23 years old and Clara Carver was 23 years old, and that they were both thoroughly adult people who could make their own decisions. And he was also aware that Amos was asking him this not because he needed permission, but because he was a young man of genuine good character, who understood the value of not bypassing the people who mattered to the people he cared about. "Amos," Paul said, "I think that is an excellent plan and you have my full support. You might also want to speak to Helen since Clara is her sister and Helen has opinions about most things. I already spoke to Mrs. Dawson," Amos said, with the small smile of someone who has done his homework. "She said yes." Paul laughed, genuine and full. "Of course she did." Clara and Amos were engaged by the end of April, and the town of Caldwell received this news with the warm satisfaction of a community that is invested in the happiness of its members. The third development of the spring of 1880 was that Helen told Paul, on a Thursday morning in April when the light was coming golden through the window of their rooms above the store, and the smell of coffee was filling the air, that she was expecting a child. She said it plainly, in the direct way she said everything, sitting across the breakfast table from him with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face to read his response clearly. Paul was very still for a moment. Then he set down his own cup and stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and took both her hands in his and held them, and he said, in a voice that had something in it she had not heard there before, something open and young and a little undone, "Helen." He stopped. "I don't have adequate words for this." "I noticed," she said with great affection. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Clara suspects already she's been looking at me with that particular expression since last week." He was still holding her hands and his grip tightened slightly. "I'm going to be," he stopped again. "A father," she offered. "I was going to say terrified," he said, and then laughed, and she laughed with him, and he sat down beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat for a while in the morning light with this new, enormous thing expanding around them. Clara did know, and had the satisfaction of being formally told and responding with a complete absence of the restraint she had maintained so admirably in other situations, which resulted in a great deal of noise and an immediate and thorough plan for what needed to be organized, which Helen listened to with genuine amusement, and then modified significantly. because this was her household and her pregnancy, and she had opinions. The child was born in November of 1880, on a day when the first snow of the season was falling soft and steady on Caldwell, making the town quiet and white and very beautiful. He was a boy, which neither of them had specified a preference about, but both felt was simply right, in the unreasonable way that things you have not anticipated often feel exactly correct once they exist. He arrived with a certain insistence about him, loudly and emphatically, and Senora Luz, who was present as she had insisted on being, said with great authority that any child who announced himself like that was going to have opinions about the world, which was generally to be preferred over a child with no opinions. Paul held him for the first time with the careful reverence of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Helen, exhausted and incandescent, watched Paul's face in those first moments, and thought that this was what she had been saying yes to every step of the way since that January evening in the back room of the store. Not just this man, but this whole expanding life he was part of, this accumulation of things that were hers and his and now theirs. They named him James Paul Dawson. James for the man who had believed in things and loved imperfectly, and left a pressed violet in a locket, and Paul for his father, and Dawson because he was theirs. The first time James Paul Dawson slept through the night, Paul told Helen quietly and with great sincerity that it was possibly the finest event of his adult life, and she laughed so hard she had to put a pillow over her face so as not to wake the baby. And Paul sat on the edge of the bed watching her laugh and thought, not for the first time, that the person he had married was the most interesting and wonderful and infuriating and essential human being he had ever encountered. Clara and Amos were married in June of 1881, in the same church where Helen and Paul had been married, and it was a somewhat louder and more elaborate celebration, because Clara had opinions about celebrations that Helen had largely not had, and Amos was willing to be organized about it because making Clara happy was, he had concluded, one of the most rewarding projects he had ever undertaken. Paul stood up for Amos and Helen stood up for Clara, and James Paul Dawson, 7 months old and possessed of his grandmother's social opinions about large gatherings, conducted himself with admirable dignity throughout the ceremony and much of the reception before deciding he was done, and saying so at some volume. The town of Caldwell continued to grow and change, and Helen and Paul grew and changed with it. The school was fully established by 1882, with Miss Hargrove having added 2 more teachers, and a curriculum that would have been remarkable even in a larger city. Helen joined the town council the same year, the first woman to do so, which occasioned a certain amount of friction from Mayor Foss and a certain amount of other friction from the other council members, all of which she handled with the particular combination of patience and absolute immovability that had served her well for years. Paul continued to marshal, and the town that had needed steadying was steadied. He was not a legend. He was not the kind of lawman who became a legend, because legends require a certain performative quality that he fundamentally lacked. He was simply the kind of man who showed up every day and did his work and was fair about it and kept his word, and after enough years of this, the town knew exactly what it had in him and valued it accordingly. The store prospered. Helen hired 2 part-time assistants to handle the counter work, which freed her for the supply negotiation and the bookkeeping that were her genuine strengths, and she expanded the selection of goods into areas that served the growing settler community: fabrics, household goods, a small selection of books that she curated herself with the pleasurable seriousness of someone who loves books and believes strongly in their practical value. In the autumn of 1883, Helen and Paul added a daughter to the household, a girl with her mother's stormwater eyes and her father's way of noticing things, whom they named Violet Ada Dawson, Violet for the flower in the locket, Ada for Ada Marsh, who had remained one of Helen's truest friends through all the years of Caldwell's changing. Young James, by now 3 years old and deeply interested in horses and dogs and loud sounds in that order, received his sister with the measured tolerance of someone who had been king of his particular territory, and was now doing the mathematics on what an addition meant. Clara and Amos's first child, a boy named William, was born the same year, 2 months after Violet, and the cousins grew up in each other's company in the way of children in a small town where the ties between families are thick and daily. The locket lived in the drawer of Helen's dressing table now. She no longer wore it every day. It had been years since she had needed to. But she kept it, and sometimes she opened it, which she did with a different quality now than she had imagined she would when she was still afraid to. The letter and the pressed violet were still inside, still fragile, still James's handwriting in his large, imprecise hand. She had never replaced them or rearranged them. They belonged there and she belonged here, and these two things were not contradictory. One evening in the winter of 1883, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Paul found her sitting at the dressing table with the open locket in her hand, reading the letter. He leaned in the doorway for a moment without speaking, watching the expression on her face, tender, complete, at peace. "You should frame it," he said. "Put the letter in a frame." She looked up at him. "I don't want to frame it." "I wanted to stay where he put it." "All right," he said simply. She closed the locket and set it in the drawer and stood up and came to him, and he put his arms around her and she rested against him with the ease of long practice and deep certainty. "He would have liked you," she said. Paul was quiet for a moment. "You've said that before." "It keeps being true," she said. He held her in the doorway of their bedroom in the quiet house above the store that was hers and theirs and the children's, with the snow falling soft outside over the town that had become their place in the world, and he felt the fullness of his life as a specific and particular thing, not a general feeling of contentment, but the precise weight of this woman in his arms and the two children sleeping down the hall and the years behind them and the years still to come. "Helen," he said. "Paul," she said. That was all. It was enough. It had always been enough. The spring of 1884 brought wildflowers up along the Cimarron in profusion, a particularly abundant year, and Helen walked out to the river bank one morning in April with both children, James, 4, running ahead of her in the purposeful way of a child who has a destination in mind even when he doesn't, and Violet, 7 months old, bundled against the lingering morning chill, and carried on Helen's hip with the easy comfort of a child who knows she is held securely. She stood at the edge of the river where she had stood 6 years ago with a fishing line she had no intention of using and a locket she had never opened, and she looked out at the water, which was running clear and cold from the winter's melt, and she thought about what it meant to have arrived at the place you were going, which you had not known was where you were going until you were there. James was crouching at the water's edge, examining something in the mud with the focused intensity of a 4-year-old scientist, and Violet was looking at the river with the great wide eyes of a 7-month-old encountering something large and moving for the first time. And behind them, Helen heard the sound of a horse and turned to see Paul coming along the creek bank on the dun horse, who was older now but still good, riding with that easy, unhurried quality he brought to everything he did. He dismounted and came to stand beside her, and James looked up and said, "Papa," with the casual satisfaction of a child for whom the presence of his father is simply a reliable fact of the universe. And Paul ruffled the boy's hair and took Violet from Helen with the practiced ease of a man who has done this 10,000 times, and the baby reached up and grabbed his face with both hands in the imperious way she had, and he smiled at her with the smile that was entirely unguarded and entirely his. The real one that reached his eyes. Helen watched him with her daughter, and she felt the river moving beside her and the morning light coming across the plains from the east, and she thought about the locket she had worn for 3 years without opening because she had been saving it, and she understood now what she had been saving it for. Not for the right moment to grieve, and not for the courage to know the past. She had been saving it for this, for the proof that things end and things continue, that love does not have a fixed quantity, that you can carry someone forward with you into a life they did not get to see and build something real in the space that opens after loss. She was 29 years old. She had a store, a husband, 2 children, a sister who lived 2 streets away and came over unannounced 3 mornings a week, a town that was growing up around her, and that she was, in measurable ways, helping to grow. She had the river and the spring, and the enormous prairie sky, and the man beside her who had ridden into Caldwell on a tired horse in the autumn of 1878 and looked at her with those gray eyes and simply, patiently, completely refused to be anything other than what she needed. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked, watching her face. "I was thinking," she said, "that I have everything." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the attention that had never diminished. "Not quite everything," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You don't have lunch yet," he said. "Senora Luz made tamales this morning and sent me to find you." Helen laughed, the real one, and Paul smiled his real smile. And James stood up from the creek bank with mud on his boots and an expression of great satisfaction about whatever he had found. And Violet made a sound of decided opinion about something. And they walked back along the river toward the town of Caldwell together, in the warm April morning. With the wildflowers thick on the bank and the creek running clear beside them, and the whole long good future stretching out ahead like the Kansas plains themselves, wide and golden and entirely, completely open. The store had a new sign that spring, the old one having been replaced the previous October after a windstorm took down the original. The new sign read Carver and Dawson Dry Goods, established 1876, and Helen had insisted on keeping the Carver name on it over Paul's mild suggestion that they might simply call it Dawson's, and he had conceded this immediately and without complaint, and she had loved him for it, specifically and deliberately, the way she had learned to love the particular true things about him rather than the general idea of him. She loved the way he listened. She loved the way he was honest about things that were uncertain, rather than pretending to certainty for the sake of authority. She loved the way he was with the children, steady and patient and genuinely delighted by them, not performing the role of father but inhabiting it. She loved that he had learned over the years exactly how she took her coffee. She loved that he still, 6 years after walking into her store for the first time, had not gotten tired of being in the same room as her, and she had not gotten tired of being in the same room as him. She loved that he had asked about the locket. She loved that he had waited. The sign caught the morning light as they came back along the main street, and she looked at it with the same satisfaction she had felt looking at it the first time it went up. It was a good sign for a good store in a town she had chosen and claimed and helped to build, and beside her was the man who had steadied himself into her life with the patient, unhurried certainty of someone who understood that good things take time and are worth the taking. James Paul Dawson, 4 years old and covered in creek mud, reached up and took his father's hand, and Violet Ada Dawson, 7 months old and convinced of her own importance, regarded the main street of Caldwell from her mother's arms with the bright, serious eyes of someone already deciding what she thought about things. And Helen Carver Dawson walked into the morning and the future and the rest of her life, with the locket in its drawer and the violets on the river bank, and everything she had ever needed exactly where it was.